Welcome to Comics Bazaar, the channel of comics commentary and arcana. This video features the Uncanny X-Men number 309, cover dated February 1994. So the cover image here featuring a looming Magneto above Professor X in his wheelchair and Amelia Voght, of all people. It was suggested or hinted in the anniversary 300 issue that there was some connection between Amelia and Professor X, and in this particular issue we learn what that is. Cover art here by John Romita Jr., inked by Dan Green. I think the colours are very effective. I think it's quite a striking, eye-catching image, and I like the composition. And of course we've got the cover captions there, a secret chapter of Professor Xavier's life, in memory most bitter. So this is one of those interesting quiet issues by Scott Lobdell, something that he specialised in back in the day. And this is an excellent one, and it picks up, clearing up a little mystery, at least making it explicit. Who was it that rescued Professor X from the blizzard in the Arctic waste in X-Men Unlimited number 1? So we'll have that revealed on the page turn. Just want to make an observation here regarding the art. This is a really nicely drawn image by John Romita Jr. and a nice spotting of blacks. And it will turn out this is not Dan Green inks, so we'll see over the page who's inking this. But the ink job is a pretty good one on this first page. And, you know, we're thrown into the middle of things. We've got Professor X facing us and talking and saying, I remember quite clearly thinking, I'm going to die. And then he has an interlocutor who we don't know who that is yet, asking here, and how did that make you feel? I knew that Scott and Aurora would be. We're not talking about Cyclops and Storm, we're talking about you, Professor Charles Francis Xavier, the most powerful mutant telepath on the entire planet, crippled, alone, stranded on an ice field in the middle of the Antarctic wastes. Again, how did it make you feel? And he responds, afraid and maybe, just maybe, a little bit relieved. So the mystery is he talking to a psychoanalyst, a therapist? Who's he talking to? Let's turn the page. So we've got a very nice double page spread here with these panels in the background recalling some of the events that occurred during X-Men Unlimited number 1. The mysterious benefactor taking care of Xavier, picking him up from the blizzard and bringing him into the Citadel here and taking care of him. And it is revealed that it was indeed Magneto who lifted up his oldest friend and enemy and took care of him. So the title here is just barely visible, When the Tigers Come at Night. And the creative team here is Scott Lobdell, writer, John Romita Jr., penciler, Dan Green, and John Holdredge. So these inks on the first page and these two pages are by Holdredge, and then we have Dan Green for the rest of the issue. Chris Eliopoulos, letterer, and Steve Buccellato, colorist. So Professor X says here, how long has it been now? 5 years, 10, my entire life, every waking moment dedicated to the single simple goal of trying to change the entire world. Not too full of myself, am I? I remember lying there in the snow thinking, if I can just fall asleep for a few minutes, I can rest, I can finally rest. But that didn't happen. It never happens. So it becomes plain that the person who rescued him was Eric, and his interlocutor asks, Eric Lensher, Magnus, Magneto, what about him? It was Magneto who saved my life that day, so why didn't I remember that until just this moment? And then the interlocutor says, I've got another question for you. And all the times you two have battled and it has gotten more than a little intense over the years, I can't recall you ever calling him by his name. Yet that day at Illyana's grave, that's Uncanny X-Men 304, and Professor X's response is, as I've said, I'm exhausted. I don't have the energy it takes to invest in all of his master of magnetism, his recent living messiah of the mutant movement kick he's on. He's a man, a dangerous, powerful, megalomaniacal man, but a man nonetheless. So that does address something that, you know, was a little puzzle for me at the time. Where did this name Eric Lensher suddenly come from? And how could it be that Xavier knew that that was his name all these years and never used it and always called him Magnus and so on and so forth? So we get a little addressing of that here with Scott Lobdell's dialogue between Professor X and this mysterious interlocutor who, if we turn the page, it is revealed, just make sure this is all on camera for you, it is revealed to be Magneto, none other than Magneto. So Professor X says here, and notice how in this scenario he's able to use his legs. So what's going on? Is this happening in reality? No, surely not. And of course, with the reveal of Magneto, whose mind was wiped in X-Men 25, this can't be conventional reality. So where is this dialogue taking place? Well, that will be revealed towards the very end of the issue. So Professor X says here, had you asked me last week, I would have insisted we were as different as night and day. That's Magneto and Professor X. That was before I turned his mind off, before I reached into his soul and shut down not only his power, but every thought, hope and dream he'd ever possessed. He saved my life, and in return, I denied him his. And Magneto here makes the point, so that makes you one and the same. Aren't you forgetting the matter of the billion odd lives he placed in jeopardy by warping the Earth's entire electromagnetic field? The thousands of lives lost, that was in Uncanny X-Men 304, what he did to Logan in X-Men 25. The pain you're feeling now is over a decision he took out of your hands. Do you honestly believe if the situation were reversed, he would spend even an instant worrying over your fate? And Professor X responds, you're saying then my guilt is all that separates us. It is only one of the things that separates us, Charles, but it is certainly a good place to start. Now, Claremont's Magneto, Magneto from issue 150 all the way to X-Men number 3, adjectiveless X-Men number 3, would have spent an instant worrying over Professor X's fate, for sure. But we've had this kind of reset of Magneto's character when he returned for Fatal Attractions, where he was much more aligned with his earlier pre-Uncanny X-Men 150 characterization. But in any case, now that his interlocutor has been revealed to be Magneto, Professor X is aghast and says, Eric, what are you doing here? You tell me, Charles, says Magneto, this is your dream. So it's all a dream, but it seems like Professor X, and this would make sense for, you know, an Omega level mutant with sonic powers, that he is capable of lucid dreaming. So it's a kind of lucid dream. And Magneto here, this personification of Magneto in his dream, says, this is your dream, although it is certainly a valid question why you chose me, the embodiment of everything you hate and fear about yourself, to represent your subconscious. One word. What one word would you use to describe me, Charles? Magneto asks, and Charles says, abuse. Now this is interesting. Great art here and storytelling by John Romita Jr. Wonderful combination of pencil, inks by Dan Green, and the colours by Buccellato. Really like the art here. Not the fact that I had to turn the page to landscape format. That's a device of Romita Jr.'s that I'll indulge his inventiveness with the layouts, but it's a little bit of a pain for moving the comic around and doing these reviews. But nonetheless, back to this business. Magneto is in effect, in a Jungian sense, he's Professor X's shadow, because for Carl Jung, the shadow is anti-ego. It's everything you deny of yourself. It's everything you regard as the opposite of yourself. And so it makes perfect sense that Magneto would embody, visually personify in the dream Professor X's shadow. So what is the upshot of this dialogue going to be between the pair? Well, we shall see. So Magneto personification presses his dialogue of Professor X and says, when Professor X tells Magneto, you abuse your power, Magneto says, and that's something you've never done, Charles? I find that difficult to believe, old friend. You never once saw something you wanted, something just for you. You never reached out and took it. You never once abused, as you would put it, your own power. And then I love this panel here where he's just sitting back in the chair. No, not once. And very laconic. But he is not giving the full story here, and we're going to find out that there was one time, and that he's deeply ashamed of it, and that he's repressed it. And that's what emerges from this dialogue between Professor X in his dream and Magneto personifying his shadow. And I love this little symbolical moment where Magneto here with the poker stokes the fire, and he says here, interesting, tell me, has anything happened recently, any major life change in yourself, or say those closest to you, that might have triggered some sense of loss, of yearning perhaps? Could it be that you find the happiness of others in the light of all the tragedies that have happened of late a bit, how should I put this, irksome, as he stokes the fire, and he's stirring the pot as well, so to speak. And I love the body language on Magneto, how nonchalant and casual he is in the body language here by John Romita Jr. Very, very nice work. And Professor X with his head tilted to one side. If you were referring with an appalling lack of subtlety to Scott and Jean's impending wedding, your accusation is patently absurd. No one could be happier for them than I am. And then we have Scott and Jean, personifications of them arriving, where Scott says, "Sir, yes, Scott, Jean and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done for us, taking me out of the orphanage, making me Cyclops and all, you know, leader of the X-Men." And Jean says, "And we aren't even bitter that you made us waste our teenage years fighting for our lives. We're happy now, together. That's all that counts." And Professor X says, "That's wonderful. I wish you nothing but the best." And Scott says, "We couldn't have done it without you, sir. Gosh, you sacrificed some of the best years of your life for us." "Yes, well," he says, "not only the years you spent with the X-Men, but all the years before that, planning and building a foundation for our future. Time well spent, I assure," says Professor X. And Scott interrupts, "It was like you threw away every chance you ever had of finding your own happiness in order to ensure ours." And Jean says here, smiling, "We just wanted you to know how much we appreciate it." Pause. "Sir." This is really good stuff from Lobdell. And then over the page, here we go. So Professor X snaps. He says, "Yes, I can see how much you appreciate it. I gave you my blessings. Isn't that enough?" That's the previous issue where Scott and Jean get engaged. And I love this visual of them shrinking in their adult clothes back to their teenage selves. And Scott whispers, "Oh, yes, sir, more than enough, sir." And Jean says here, "Sorry we upset you, Professor." And then he's repentant. "No, I'm the one who's sorry. Tell me, Eric, why is it I can't genuinely be happy for them?" And we saw that on the last page of the previous issue where he had reservations, where he wasn't as happy as the rest of the X-Men and extended family for Scott and Jean. "Why do I resent them?" he asks here. And Magneto says, "I don't know. Could it be their marriage represents something you desire deep in your heart of hearts, something missing from your own solitary life?" And then, just like a good psychoanalyst, he asks the question, "Tell me about your family, Charles. Tell me, what was it like growing up?" And Professor X says here, "That would involve my mother. My father died when I was very young." That's his father, Brian Xavier. "Fine, tell me about your mother." Love this here. And, you know, because when I was rereading this, I was thinking, when was it ever established that Professor X had blonde hair or sandy coloured hair? And it's back in X-Men number 12, like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's X-Men number 12, that's the colour of his hair. And we'll see it turn up a little later in the issue as well, not just young Charles. So he says, "She was perfect. Sharon Xavier was an angel on earth without equal. She was the most caring, most giving person I've ever known. I loved her with all my heart." Magneto here. This is a bit out of character, but remember, it's a dream. He says, "Ain't." Wrong answer, Charles. If we're going to get at the heart of what it is that's bothering you, the entire reason you're here, you're going to have to be honest. Any lie you tell me is a lie you're telling yourself. And here is revealed his villain's costume, because he's asking something that's putting Professor X under pressure here. So as a personification, he really is embodying the shadow. This is difficult and painful for Professor X, as he remembers his stepfather, Kurt Marco, hitting his mother. So Magneto asks here, "Is the truth that difficult for you to admit? The truth is seen through the eyes of a 10-year-old boy who thought his mother a coward, who drank herself into a stupor rather than defend herself from the abuse at the hands of your stepfather, Kurt Marco?" And Professor X here says, "I should have been able to do something, anything to help her. She was the parent, Charles. You were the child. It was her job to protect you." And then he goes through some justifications for his mother, realizes that he was probably reaching out with his embryonic sonic powers to share her pain and in an effort to alleviate it, but it wasn't enough. And something I want to note here, and I've noted it in previous videos of this era of John Romita Jr.'s art, is I love the hatching on the contour, which indicate the contours of the face. I really do think at this point now, if you fed in an AI program John Romita Jr.'s art, you could print 3D models of his characters Like, the man has such a command of the human figure in his style that he can draw it from any angle in his style, and it's very effective. And the way that he is hatching, shading the planes of the physiognomy of faces, I particularly appreciate and enjoy in this era of John Romita Jr.'s art. So then Magneto sits down in his, well, it looks like an analyst's chair, doesn't it? I think you've developed something of a, for a lack of a better word, a human fetish. And so Professor X is not happy with that explanation. That's obscene. And Magneto says, I think you spent the rest of your life trying to protect human women the way you were unable to rescue your mother. So he talks about Gabrielle Haller, and this is a callback to Uncanny X-Men 161. And he says, Magneto says, not much of a coincidence was it that you lost interest in her shortly after she stopped needing you. And Professor X begins to say, I hardly lost interest, but he interrupts. And what about Moira? I'd rather not discuss my past with Dr. MacTaggart at this time, Professor X says. But Magneto pushes the point, and Professor X gets activated. Moira loved me, he says. Nothing you can say can change what we meant to each other, what we had together. And Magneto's reading this letter that nobody's seen except for Professor X from Moira. Dearest Charles, I never meant to blah blah blah. Here we go. I apologize if I led you to believe we had a future together. I've met someone like me, and I feel I owe it to myself to give it a chance. So Professor X grabs the letter, and we see what he did with the original letter back in the day when he received it with his little French beret there, setting it on fire and dropping it to burn in his dinner. So Magneto presses home the point. You weren't angry. Hurt, yes, but not angry, says Professor X. Then I misspoke. I apologize. And Professor X says, it's not as if I'm incapable of having a healthy relationship with someone. Lalandra and I have shared a bond for years now, a bond that spans. And Magneto interrupts, Charles, please. You're involved with an alien princess of an intergalactic empire some millions of light years away. Not too inaccessible, eh? Turn the page to landscape. And Professor X here looking out the window. Love the spotting of blacks and shading here. Don't you think it odd that this is all coming to a head now, says Magneto, at this particular crossroad in your life? The self-doubt, the recrimination, the longing to belong to something, someone bigger than yourself, instead of trying to fight it, to ignore it, to hide from it. Why don't you take a look at it, Charles? What piece of unfinished business is there? What unhealed wound has been opened recently? Something perhaps in your past that you're ashamed of? So here we go. Here we get to the point, the thing that he's ashamed of. India. Excuse me. So he remembers the point at which he was first paralyzed, how he ended up in this hospital in Bombay, and how he basically shut down emotionally, even though he was left with his mutant mind. And we see here his blonde, sandy beard. And then he has this nurse who addresses him here, Xavier Charles F. It says on your chart that you're an American. Me too, she says. I make it a point to visit all the Americans that come through the hospital. You know, catch up on the Mets, reminisce about mom, hot dogs and apple pie. Look, Xavier Charles F., I have to be at work in 10 minutes, so we're going to have to resume this conversation such as it is another time. How about after my rounds? And he says nothing because he's basically shut down emotionally. Perfect. For the record, the name is Vott, Amelia C. Thanks for asking. So here we go. We're getting to what was this relationship between Amelia, one of the acolytes, and Professor X. And it turns out to be a most interesting relationship indeed. So there seems to have been something of a Florence Nightingale syndrome or situation that developed where she takes a shine to Professor X. Charles, despite his narkiness, or what would I say, cranky nature over, well, understandably so, over being paralyzed, as she's helping him with his exercises and rehabilitation. And she tells him here, you're one of the most intelligent, dare I say, brilliant men I've ever known, and you have the love of a beautiful woman. So he's there. I don't mean to appear bitter, Amelia, but it's just that I've always, did you just say the love of a beautiful woman? So she says, which part of the sentence are you questioning, my love or the assumption of my beauty? There's something I must... You're incredible, Xavier. For 2 weeks, I can't get you to talk now. I can't get you to shut up. I think you should know I'm a... This is great. As she kisses him. And he was about to say mutant. So you didn't tell her, says Magneto, as the curtains are drawn around his bed. Not at that particular moment, no. And that's pretty understandable, yes. And then I like this establishing shot of Bombay. She found that out on her own about 3 months later. We'd been staying in a 2-room apartment in Bombay. And just the way that John Romita Jr. renders it, it's this ladder leading from one roof to the other. That tells you that it's Bombay and not New York, right? So they're in the 2-room apartment in Bombay. He is happy. He cannot recall a time where he was more at peace with himself, but he's busy. He's working on forming the X-Men. So he says here to the personification of Magneto, he says, I confess to having been a bit obsessed, having met you in Israel, Eric. That was issue on Uncanny X-Men 161. My previous confrontation with Amal Farouk, so that was Uncanny X-Men 117, clearly illustrated to me the need to be able to identify mutants, both the obvious and the less so. So he's working on this machine, Cerebro, that would boost his sonic powers to identify mutants around the world. Amelia finds the blueprints and notes, and she's disgusted. She says, a device designed to identify and locate Homo sapiens superior. He asks for forgiveness, and he says, I would have shared everything with you in due time. I fail to see where my work would have any impact on you at all unless, my God, you're a mutant? And she responds, mutant, Charles, is that what they're calling us now back in the States? Before I left to get away from the States, the fear, the hatred I saw in the eyes of my own parents, we were just called freaks. Take a good look at your freak, Charles. Look at the lab rat you've been experimenting on. And then he makes contact with her telepathically in a panic. And she realizes all of a sudden, just as she's about to strike him, that he's a mutant too. And so they're reconciled. And then here's Professor X at the broken window panes. I love the lighting on this. The use of blacks by Romita Jr. and Dan Green. It's lovely stuff. And then the choice of colors by Buccellato. Really nice. So Professor X says to Magneto, personified himself, his subconscious, you can imagine how it felt, Eric, can't you, to have spent your entire life knowing you were different, believing in the furthest recesses of your soul that you were somehow flawed, living a lie because no one could possibly share a pain you knew was unique, only to discover you were never truly alone at all. So why didn't it work out? Well, I love this sequence here. This is really well worked out by Lobdell, where Professor X is reluctant to go into what exactly it was that he's ashamed about in their breakup, where Amelia leaves once she gets the notion, once Professor X in the X Mansion takes in Scott Summers, and she says, I've been telling you for months that I wasn't going to help you with this, but you either didn't believe me or didn't care. Despite your best intentions, gathering mutants together is only going to exacerbate the problem. Don't you see? Magnus will gather his people, someone else will gather theirs. Before you know it, the world will be caught in the crossfire of a genetics arms race, which is what it turned out to be in the history of the X-Books, yes? And she says, I can't condone your noble actions because I think they'll ultimately destroy us all, and she walks out. And Magneto's not happy here. He says, but it wasn't as clean as that, was it, Charles? What aren't you telling me? So then we start off with the speech, I can't condone your noble intentions that will ultimately destroy us all. And he argues with her. And he says, all I'm trying to do is give Scott and Jean and anyone else we find a chance. And so he's holding her hand, restraining her. And she says to him, what about us? What about our responsibilities to each other? And she walks out and says, it's your goal, a dream you began long before you met me. You can't change the world with a dream, Charles. I love you too much to watch you throw your life away. And it's still not the shameful moments, closer, but it doesn't explain the anger, the guilt, the resentment. Tell me the truth. Tell yourself the truth. What really happened that night, that moment? So here we go. We get to the core of it, where she's walking out down the stairs and he uses his sonic powers to restrain her. No, I will not let you leave me, he says. I should have tried to talk to her, he says to Magneto in the dream, to convince her to stay. Instead, in a maddened panic I've not felt since, I reached out and seized her mind with my own and began to telepathically force her to see my point of view. It was thankfully a passing madness, and we see his shock at himself here in this particular image. And then she turns and he says she never said a word, but it was all there in her eyes, the shock, the hurt, the sense of betrayal. And she slaps him in the face. I'd told her more than once that I loved her, and I did. But when it came down to believing in us, to trusting her love, I failed her. I failed myself. So that's it. And here he recalls the sting of the slap on his cheek, the rebuke. And he says, my actions were selfish, vulgar. What I did was a violation of her personal freedom, her right to make her own choices, to live her own life. And this is all ironic in the context of what he's done to Magneto back in X-Men 25, wiping his mind. He's taken all of those things away from Magneto. And Magneto personified says here, and that bothered you because in a moment of weakness I did something I'd sworn my entire life that I would not do. My actions that day made me no better than my stepfather, using my power to lash out at someone weaker, to take from myself that which someone was unwilling to give. So he says, the choices we make, the limits we set for ourselves will determine whether or not any of us manage to maintain our claim to humanity. I'm not you, Eric, and I never will be. And his shadow says, my point all along, Charles, you simply had to say it yourself in order to believe it. Maybe you're also ready to hear this. Maybe you can finally understand that it is possible to be true to your goal and still pursue your own personal happiness. The two are not mutually exclusive. And Professor X asks, are you referring to what Scott and Jean have? Exactly what Scott and Jean have. So that's the epiphany for Professor X and the climax of his dream. And we see in the last couple of pages that he wakes up at exactly that point. And Jean is there, and she was just putting a blanket on him because he'd fallen asleep while reading. And there's the fire, the real fire in the land of the waking. And he says, look, don't apologize. Somehow I'm certain I was about to wake up anyway. So he's back home, and Jean responds, yes, well, now that you're up, maybe you should go to bed. Good night, sir. And he holds her hand to call her back and says, Jean, please, I'm sorry if I let you and the others down. And she says to him, Charles, just because I don't agree with your decision to open the doors of our home to Sabretooth, that was X-Men Unlimited number 3, doesn't mean for an instant that I think you could ever possibly let me down. And here we go to the emotional climax of the issue. After everything you've sacrificed on behalf of each and every one of us, it'd be impossible to ignore all of it in the light of a single disagreement. Sir, where would we be? Where would any of us be if we didn't have each other? You're the one who brought us here, and that's a debt we can never repay. So different from Scott and Jean in the dream, the way he feels that they might feel, what she says to him is different. And he says to her here, actually, Jean, there is something you can do for me 2 Saturdays from now. The wedding. So Scott and Jean are getting married in a fortnight. Name it, Charles. Love him, he says. Big emotional denouement as they have a big hug here. Promise with your marriage to love Scott forever and to be secure enough with yourself to allow him to return that love. Because this is exactly what the X-Men were created for. What it is we continue to fight for every day of our lives, the chance at least to know happiness. And just so there's no further misunderstanding, he says, I want you to know in no uncertain terms that I love you, Jean Grey. And so she responds in kind, and I love you too with all my heart and soul. I'll keep your promise, sir, and thank you for everything. So really nice, touching, emotional moment here between Professor X and Jean. And also a very interesting look into Professor X's past, the addition of Amelia Voght into his back history, and weaving that into his relationship with Magneto. So an excellent issue in my view. Great combination of art, story, colors, really works very well. Let me know what you think about this issue in the comment section. And then we have an advertisement here for what turns out to be Scott and Jean's honeymoon, The Adventures of Cyclops and Phoenix. And the letters page, which concerns issues 305 and 306. and interestingly has one of these statement of ownership columns, which reveals that in the previous 12 months, the single highest number of issues printed was, let's call it 850,000 copies. And the actual numbers of single issues nearest to filing date, 704,000. So the numbers are starting to dip down a little bit after the highs of 1992, 91 to 93. We haven't quite got to the point of the bursting of the speculator bubble, but it's coming. So I do hope that you enjoyed this review and commentary on Uncanny X-Men 309. If you did, please like the video on YouTube, and if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more content like this.